With massive upheaval in Washington and plans by President Trump to potentially dismantle the U.S. Department of Education, some Democrats and Republicans are pushing to ensure Pell Grants don't end up on the chopping block. Globe Rhode Island's Steph Machado wrote about the history of the Pell Grant earlier this week, which of course is named for a Rhode Island senator. Steph joins me now live in studio to talk about it. Steph, thanks for being here.
Thanks as always for having me, Kim.
So many of our viewers, of course, remember Senator Claiborne Pell, who died back in 2009. But they may not know the history of sort of how the Pell Grant got started. So can you tell us what you found out?
Yeah, so Pell Grants have become so ubiquitous and really ingrained in the language of higher ed that many people, particularly outside of Rhode Island, don't even connect them with a person named Pell anymore. In fact, everyone I spoke to for this story mentioned to me that it's very common for people to just think Pell is another acronym, just like so many other laws passed by Congress. And apparently he'd be fine with that, by the way. I'm told by people who knew him, including his grandson Clay Pell, of course, Senator Jack Reed, and former staffers, that he was very humble and he was embarrassed when the grants were renamed after him by Congress in 1980. I spoke to Tom Hughes, who was Senator Pell's chief of staff. He's now 82. He says he's one of the last people alive who worked on the original legislation with Pell, and he says the idea stemmed from Senator Pell returning from World War II and realizing how the GI Bill was really helping former soldiers go to college without going into debt. He himself was a wealthy Newport patrician, so he didn't need any aid, but he felt that everyone should have access to go to college, and there was a great long fight in Washington, and eventually the grants were passed in 1972, and they have helped tens of millions of Americans afford college.
So let's get back to sort of the impetus behind why you wrote this story right now, which is what do we know about whether or not these grants could be in trouble amid all of the funding cuts and cuts to the Department of Education in Washington and the potential abolition of the department?
Yeah, so the grants existed before the modern Department of Education was created in 1979, but they are now under the department along with a lot of other federal funding for education. And Rhode Island's congressional delegation has expressed fears about what will happen with Pell Grants. Some Republican members of Congress have also brought up concerns. President Trump has not said he wants to cut Pell Grants, and his nominee for Education Secretary, Linda McMahon, said in her confirmation hearing that she does not want to cut Pell Grants. She is not confirmed yet. Trump is reportedly, though, preparing an executive order about dismantling the Department of Education. He will need congressional approval, I will say, to get rid of it completely. Elon Musk's Doge team is slashing federal funding across the government every day. The Education Department has threatened to withhold funds from states and from colleges who have DEI. The House passed a budget resolution this week that calls for $330 billion in unspecified cuts to education. So there's just a lot of moving parts. And even though Pell Grants, by all accounts, are popular and have bipartisan support, it is a very large, multi-billion-dollar program, so there is some fear and uncertainty there.
Lots of questions still remaining. And Steph, you reported in your piece that the Pell Grants are running a deficit. So was the program already in need of more money before President Trump even took office?
Yeah, so last fiscal year, Congress appropriated a certain amount of money for the Pell Grants, but there were more students who qualified, so it did run a deficit. So arguably, it needs more money from Congress. Now, experts I spoke to also point out one of the flaws in the original Pell Grant legislation is that the grant amount is not tied to inflation. So the value of a Pell Grant, they have gone up over the years, but they're not, they don't go up automatically. So the value of a Pell Grant is much less than it was 50 years ago. It can pay for a lot less of a college education. The maximum grant amount right now is a little bit more than $7,000 a year. Some are pushing for it to be $13,000. I will note there are also some pretty strong concerns that other types of federal student aid tied to, let's say, race or gender could be cut because of Trump's DEI orders. So that would make the Pell Grant even more important in the equation of how students are going to afford college.
All right. Well, thank you for breaking all of this and the history of it down. You can check more about the Pell Grant and Steph's article, including the legacy of Rhode Island Senator Claiborne Pell and the history of the Pell Grants, right now at globe.com/RI. Steph Machado, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Kim.